What's going on, my fellow Jedi and Padawans? Welcome back to another Jedi gaming video. Thank you guys so much for coming back to the channel, and if you guys are new, welcome. In today's video here for our Titan, I'm going to be going over 3 different builds for y'all. Very similar, just taking it in for each our Arc subclass, our Solar subclass, and our Void subclass, utilizing the same exotic Heart of Inmost Light chess piece. This thing makes all of these subclasses super viable for the end game and makes a Titan very adaptable and very versatile as well in that end game, going with protection, DPS, ad clear, and a bunch of different items based on what we're using subclass wise, and this chess piece is S tier no matter what anyone else says. So starting us off right here for our weapons, I want to go over them first because we're going to be using these in all of our loadouts as well as most of the armor mods that we have on. Traverse to the other subclasses, we're going to go over Arc first, and this is what I was using for Insight Terminus 98% of the time, with substituting Bubble and Hammers for a couple runs just to test it. But to start out right here for our kinetic, we're going to go with Wither Horde for sure this season, especially with Breaching Clear, but just in general for my endgame loadouts. And with the Heart of Inmost Light chess piece, we're throwing on Wither Horde for that damage aspect as well as that ad management. One of the best guns in the game, no doubt. Now, when we move on to our energy weapons right here, this is where we're going to be using these for other shields as well as other champion types, because our Wither Horde is going to be our majority time for unstoppables, with the exception of something like our Arc. We can use our mod from the season, which our Arc melee stuns unstoppables, but majority of the time it will be Wither Horde. For these weapons, we have under your skin that Void Bow. We have the Velis X Void Pulse Rifle, which I absolutely love, especially when we pair this with our Void subclass. For our SMGs right here for Overload, we have Callus Mini Tool and Ikelos. You can throw the Funnel Web on as well. We also have the Doom of Chelchis, which is used this season for overloads, but in the past is used for other things, unstoppables as well as barriers. So this thing, one of my favorite PvE weapons to use, as well as Insidious, kind of the same concept. Barriers this season has been used in the past for unstoppables, so bringing all of these in with me and just rotating them in and out depending on the shield types that we have going on and what we have to deal with champion wise. Now, I know in Lightfall we're having that match game get changed up, so we're not going to have to worry as much about the burns on our different weapons, but just in general, these right here are my go-tos for my endgame content with GM builds, stuff like that. So for this, in the aspect of the Heart of Inmost Light, this is what I'm bringing in for energy weapons. And then our 3 heavies that we're bringing in, since we are using the Wither Horde, is going to be Typhon for Void, that Cataclysmic for Juicy DPS with a Bait and Switch for Solar, as well as that Storm Chaser, still looking for a Vorpal weapon roll. After so many clears, we're going with this for that triple tap and that arc burn. So these are juicing for DPS, all 3 of them. Very good at breaking shields as well. Now, when we move on to our armor, like I said earlier, this is basically going to stay the same for the majority of the time, with substituting in some of those champion mods, etc. But right here, we're going to have Ashes to Assets, so every single time we get those grenade defeats, we get super energy, allowing us to cast our Bubble, our Slam in Thunder Crash, as well as our Hammers for our Solar build. Now, we're also going to have Well of Ordnance, so picking up Solar Elemental Wells grant us additional copies of that grenade energy. We're just using this for other teammates using Solar subclasses, or when we do for our hammers, it makes it very easy to get back our grenades with that grenade launcher finder for our Wither Horde. Now, moving on to our arms right here, we're going to be changing this up slightly because of our different champion mods. Now, we're going to be taking off that stat for increased resilience, moving it down to the +5 while throwing on that retrofit on our chest piece to bring it back up to 100 overall. But we're going to be using that because of the unstoppable grenade launcher is 7 energy, which is so much in my personal opinion. And then we have to have on something like piercing bow or our anti-barrier pulse rifle, overload SMGs, something else in that slot for our other champions. But some of the time, like I said, with my arc especially, since I probably run this the majority of the time in the Grandmasters and endgame is arc builds, is the fastball and elemental ordnance. When we get defeats with our grenades, it spawns us elemental wells and we can throw that grenade a little bit better. Now, what makes the Titan so versatile and so good for the endgame content with this chest piece here? We have overflowing light, so using our abilities, grenade, melee, or barricade, empowers the other 2 abilities. Empowering means the abilities have faster regens, melees and grenades do more damage, and barricades have more hit points. So this is super clutch because we're able to chain our abilities back and forth with empowering the others. So you can go in, throw a grenade, cast your barricade out, and then melee someone, and you're getting those back instantly almost, it feels like, with the builds that we have. And with that empowering going on, they do more damage. So with this, all of our different grenades are going to be doing more damage. Me personally, I choose our storm grenades for our arc builds. I use our thermite grenades for our solar builds. And then I also use our vortex grenade when I'm going in there for void. Now I will go over those when we go over our subclasses, but they make so good with that empowering and such good regen and damage on them. Bonk Titan with that solar as well, we get that extra damage, and we have that ability to have that empowered barricade with all of our different builds, which have more health points, and something like with our void that gives us that overshield on top of that. So very clutch and an S tier Titan armor piece for sure, and will carry over into Lightfall, no doubt. Now for our mods on this, we're going to be using another elemental ordnance, so our grenades, whatever we're using, whether it be those storm, void in vortex, or solar in thermite, they're going to be creating us elemental wells of that certain type. Then we're going to be using linear fusion reserves for our 3 different linears, whichever one that we're using, as well as concussive dampener, melee resistance, or sniper resistance, depending on the endgame content we're going into and what kind of enemies we're facing. Moving on to our legs right here, we're going to be using linear fusion scavenger, so when we pick up those heavy bricks, we get a couple more shots for our heavy. We're also going to be using innervation, so when we get an orb of power, picking that up, we get our super, as well as reduced grenade cooldown. Like I said, I love grenades, and with that Heart of Inmost Light, we're able to get them back faster with that regen anyways, and with innervation, so they can do some crazy damage on enemies, add clear potential, especially with something like the Arc Titan here and those broken storm grenades with that aspect. Now we're also going to be using bountiful wells, which allows us to stack our 2 copies of elemental ordnance, which just allow us to create more of those elemental wells of whichever variety depending on our subclass that we have on. And last but not least, on our class item right here, we're going to be using Weaken Clear this season for sure for that grenade launcher aspect in Wither Horde, making those enemies that it hits weakened so they can take more damage. On this arc build, I personally have a low entropy superconductor, so my arc melee can stun unstoppable champions, but another great option for in that slot, which is one is Advanced Scout. Champions that you stun take additional damage from those fellow guardians in your fire team. So if you're on your void or your solar builds, definitely throw on Advanced Scout so those champions take more damage. But for me, I run this low entropy superconductor on arc so I can stun those unstoppable champions as well. So moving on right here to our subclasses that I'm going to be going over. First is our Striker Titan. So for our arc, we're going to be using Thunder Crash for that gnarly DPS with our Towering Barricade and Strafe Lift. Now for me, I'm going to be using Seismic Strike or Thunderclap depending on the situation. Most of the time I will be using Thunderclap, but for getting away and definitely depending on if they're snipers or not, I was using Seismic Strike so I could use that quick jolt around a corner. Now, as always, for our Arc Titans in the PvE realm, running those Storm Grenades, purely because of our aspect over here, Touch of Thunder. So those Storm Grenades, after detonating, create a roaming thunder cloud that track nearby targets and create fire bolts of lightning at foes beneath, making that damage absolutely crazy, especially with Heart of Inmost Light when they get empowered ×2 after a melee and a shield cast. Those lightning and storm grenades are absolutely gnarly. On top of that, we're using knockout, so when we get those melee defeats with our thunderclap or our other seismic strike melee, we're getting that health regen as well as that nice jolt, and makes us amplified with that melee range and damage increase as well. Now for our fragments with this build, we're using Spark of Magnitude for that extra long effect of our arc grenades. We're using Spark of Ions, so jolting targets when we defeat them, we get ionic traces, allowing us to again spam our abilities in our barricade, melee, and grenade a little bit more often, especially with Heart of Inmost Light. Very, very clutch and very high damage. Next off, we're using that Spark of Feedback, so taking melee damage briefly increases outgoing melee damage, helps a lot for Seismic Strike as well as that Thunderclap. And last but not least, for our Striker Titan here, we're going with Spark of Shock, so our arc grenades also jolt targets, comes in clutch as well because of those jolted targets creating ionic traces, and again giving us back our abilities even faster. Now when we move on to our Sentinel subclass here for Void, we're going to be using Ward of Dawn for that protection aspect and keeping everybody safe with Weapons of Light as well. Now we're using Towering Barricade and Strafe Lift again, with Shield Bash this time is the go-to in my opinion, with Vortex Grenades. Now for our aspects on here, we're going to be using Controlled Demolitionist, so hitting targets with void abilities or volatile explosions makes them volatile. Further damage to a volatile target causes them to explode, so with both our grenade and our melee, we're going to cause targets to become volatile. Those grant health when they explode near us and our allies. Now we're also going to be using Bastion, so when we throw down our barricade, we get overshield as well as our nearby allies. So this is very, very nice for that end game content, keeping you alive, especially with the Heart of Inmost Light. Like I've said many times, gives us our regen for our abilities very, very quickly, able to spam and chain them very often. Now for our fragments here, we're going to be using Echo of Remnants, so that Vortex Grenade lasts a little bit longer. Next off, we're going to be using Echo of Undermining, so our Void Grenade also weakens targets, which just comes into play for that end game content, doing a little bit more damage. And with Heart of Inmost Light, we're going to get grenades back super, super fast, so being able to weaken more targets is very clutch for end game activities. Last but not least, we're going with Echo of Instability, so defeating targets with those grenades gives our weapons that are void volatile rounds. Usually we'll have one void weapon on us as well, no matter what we're going into, so this is clutch, which also helps us proc Controlled Demolitionist because those void explosions gives us health, so it's a nice end game feedback loop for health, giving us grenade energy, volatile rounds, everything of that aspect giving us heals. So it's a very, very clutch aspect to have for this Titan build and just end game in general. Now, last but not least, we're going on to our Sunbreaker subclass with Hammer of Soul. Definitely our add, clear, and add management super of the three. Now, again, we're going to be using Tower Barricade and Strafe Lift. This time, we're going to be using Throwing Hammer because of that empowerment with the Barricade and our Grenade and Heart of Inmost Light. Being able to constantly throw our melee gives us empowering basically constantly for our Grenade and Barricade, allowing us to use our Thermite, which in turn gives this empowering and our Barricade. So it is probably the best feedback loop that we have with our abilities in the Throwing Hammer and Thermite, as well as that Barricade with Heart of Inmost Light. Now we're also going with the Aspects Roaring Flame here, so defeating enemies with solar abilities or ignitions stacks damage for solar abilities, so another way, like I said, for that to pair well with Heart of Inmost Light and our Bonk Hammer especially. Next off, we're going to be Soul Invictus, so solar abilities, Hammer of Soul impacts, defeating scorched targets, create sunspots, which will give us ability regen again, allowing us to chain our abilities with Heart of Inmost Light, absolutely cracked, sunspots everywhere, and scorch and all of those solar explosions. Now for our fragments down here, we're going to be using Ember of Blistering, so defeating targets with solar ignitions grant grenade energy, just another way to spam our grenades a little bit more often. Next, we're using Ember of Torches, so those powered melee attacks against combatants makes us and nearby allies radiant. Since we're always going to have the throwing hammer and it's basically always going to be empowered, we're going to get this to proc very often and keep radiant up very, very consistently. Next off, we're going to be using Ember of Searing, so defeating scorched targets grants us melee energy, another way for us to get back our abilities, just in case we do happen to throw our hammer off the map or can't get to it before it explodes. And last but not least, for this Sunbreaker build here, we're using Ember of Benevolence, so applying Restoration, Cure, or Radiant to allies grants increased grenade, melee, and class ability regen for short durations, so this is another way, like I said, with this solar class and our abilities. Heart of Inmost Light, probably the best synergy for regen. Feels like you have all of them instantly and all of the time with that empowered ×2, so they do some gnarly damage as well. So hopefully you guys enjoy this little different aspect here with one exotic, Heart of Inmost Light, breaking it into 3 different builds for our Sunbreaker, our Thunder Crash, as well as our Bubble Titan. So thank you guys again so much for that support and everything over this past year. Got a lot coming up with Lightfall, and I truly appreciate all of y'all. So I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.